Hi, I'm Ethan Wong, and today I'm here speaking with Joseph Campana. And for the first question, just kind of a very general overview that I ask all of the poets that come on here, which is, what to you is special about poetry as an art form, as in what is special about it compared to others, and why would you pursue poetry as opposed to these others?
Okay, well, first off, Ethan, thanks so much for having me. The conversations you've been having with poets are fantastic. I've learned a lot listening to them, so I'm really delighted to be part of one. Um, this is a really important question. It can seem really simple, but it's not. And I often talk, whether it's with students that I teach who are learning to read and kind of live with poems, or learning to write them, or both. I often want to say to them, what is it that's distinctive about a way of using language such that it really needs to be a poem, right? It's not that poems don't share other qualities with other kinds of writing. Of course they do. They share things with fiction. They share things with all sorts of art. But what is it that needed to be a poem and not, a greeting card and not think of the many different kinds of writing? And of course, poems are great because they play with conventions of language and things that we associate with particular kinds of speech. But what is it that needed to be a poem and not any number of other things, like a text to a friend, like an Instagram post? And again, there are ways that poetry flirts with all of those things too. But what special use of language as it kind of sublimates and becomes so incredibly powerful, what needed to be the poem? And that's a hard question to answer. And I think when you answer it for yourself, then you're also on the stage, you're really on the path of thinking, what are the poems I need to write? The things that I need to do that need to be poems and not other kinds of writing or other kinds of speech.
Yeah, in that regard, you're definitely right in that this is kind of a question you need to ask yourself, depending on who you are. The answer definitely differs drastically because it's kind of all about, and recently I think we've been better about this in terms of we're more open to seeing many more things as poetry, accepting them as poetry, and then that's letting everyone kind of do their own version of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's a complicated thing. You want to be able to say that almost anything can be in a poem, almost any kind of speech. It can mimic and work with the form of a letter. It can mimic and work with so many forms, a list, right? And you want to have that sort of openness about it. But I guess I also still want something that feels like there's something special that needed to be a poem and not something else, which again, isn't even necessarily about the content per se. It's about a way of using language. It's about a desire to see it on a page or a screen in a particular kind of way. And I'm also thrilled that people have so many different answers to that question. It's not that it should be a restrictive question. It's only one answer, or, one poet or a set of poets should be answering that question. I just think the urgency behind it, being able to answer that urgency as much as anything else, is what makes real poems that really lift off the page or whatever surface they're on and really impact us.
And kind of actually on that same vein of this special aspect, which makes it, which necessitates poetry as opposed to another art form, kind of how much does form, strict form, or what other kinds of form ever
Yeah.
play into that for you? And kind of actually adding on to that question, if you don't mind, besides like the very plain forms that everyone knows, like a sonnet or an iambic pentameter or whatever, how do you discover other forms separate from that?
Yeah, this is a really important question. I think form is one of the most interesting things that happens in poetry, but it can also seem like the least interesting because we're used to the idea that certain received forms are so old, they're almost like fossils, right? But on the other hand, fossils are fascinating to look at, and some of them are very much living forms. So I'll say, so in my everyday life, I'm a professor of poetry, but I'm a professor of older poetries. I teach Shakespeare, I teach that era. I also teach creative writing. And so for me, I want every sort of possibility that I can have when I'm sitting down to write. So for me, the history of poetry and the history of form particularly, those are sort of assets. It's not the attempt to sound like 400 years ago because because that'll make the poem better. That would be actually weird and interesting. People who try to sound like an antiquated age, that's actually a weird thing to do, and that's kind of interesting. But it doesn't come out of just slavishly imitating older things. Having said that, form, whether, so if we're talking about received forms, right, that have meter and rhyme, for instance, as you mentioned, or sonnets and villanelles and all sorts of things, those are fascinating. Whenever you enter into them, there's a process of learning to do the form or to make the form happen. But then there's a point at which, if you keep doing it, you start to transform it. Right. Which is why you could say, I'm writing a sonnet, and then I might say, well, what kind? Because there are just dozens and dozens of kinds. Now, talk about a form that's lasted, I don't know, 700, 800 years. It's because people still keep finding something about its structure useful, even as they use it in really, really different ways. The difference between formal poetry, so to speak, and other kinds of poetry, which are sometimes called free verse, except, like most things, like lunch, free verse isn't free. Free verses, or sort of forms that don't use consciously particular forms, they have to create their own shape on the page. So everybody has to have some kind of form or shape. The question is, what generates it? Is it received and it becomes a constraint that you work with and you work against, which is really interesting actually to do when you kind of practice it for a while? Or is it that you create a poem on the page and you have to figure out, sometimes that's actually harder. It seems like it's easier because it's free. You have to figure out, how should this look and feel on the page? And sometimes the thing that will hold a poem most up is not sequence of words or what it's saying, but how should it be on the page so that it comes alive? So I think there are often, so actually I love teaching when I get a chance. I love teaching forms classes. Again, and not to kind of, it's the good version of constraint. It's working against something that gives you a kind of impulse. It's like being able to push off, from the side of a pool. You get your momentum because you're pushing off against something. And that's a beautiful thing. It doesn't have to be a kind of restrictive thing.
Yeah, I definitely agree that I kind of, the way that I grew up reading poetry was I only ever read like the classics. And
Yeah.
so my starting point was just, I remember one afternoon I wanted to write a poem for something, and I literally just took old like books of old poetry, like collections I had, like read a bunch of them and then tried to ironically like imitate them and their form. And then I had to kind of, and I found it much more difficult as I got on, as you kind of mentioned, to have to go free verse because I was kind of making it up as I went. But it's not like I can just leave it totally scattered. Eventually, I have to create some kind of structure around it.
Yeah. I mean, well, listen, you did something that's actually really important, which is, I mean, I said earlier, you don't want to feel like at the end of a process working on a poem, it was merely imitative, like as in you didn't really add that much to the process. You kind of worked with only someone else's pattern of thought or pattern of language. However, modeling and imitation are a great part of learning to write. And in fact, so some of the classics, so if you go back to, yeah, sort of Shakespeare's era, a lot of the way people learn to write, both sentences in prose and poetry on the page, was through translation and imitation. And they gradually became, and then those who were really, really interesting writers, they came into their own sort of voice and their own patterns, but they were comfortable borrowing because it's a pattern of borrowing and transformation, right? So, and again, this is work that I teach a lot. And so not everybody feels this way about, I always think, again, the history of poetry is an archive of possibilities and an archive of solutions to problems you do not yet know you've had. And they don't work one to one, right? It's funny, I was in graduate school studying, literary studies, but I was writing poetry and publishing it for the first time. And I knew people in my program who were also doing PhDs, and many of us who were also poets were friends with the folk in the MFA program, and which was great. There was a lovely community there, but many of them were trying to study 20th century poetry and write their own. And they were, in a sense, jammed up because they were, I think, got caught up in imitating a little too much a voice that was much more proximate, and some of them were still living poets. How do you write a dissertation on John Ashbery while John Ashbery is still alive and you're reading his poems? It really kind of froze them up as for writing their own poems. I was studying really old things, and my temptations to borrow language, it would have to become something interesting for me to use it in a poem. So I
Mm.
was fortunate. I never had too much of a very contemporary language in my head, so that I was always sort of having to transform things. And they're great versions of that. It's a really wonderful, you might enjoy this. great 20th century artist named Robert Rauschenberg made illustrations for Dante's Inferno. And so the Museum of Modern Art published a little catalog of them, and they invited two just amazing poets, Kevin Young and Robin Costa Lewis, to write contemporary poems to go with them. And Robin Costa Lewis did an erasure. So she took a translation and removed language to create new poems. And Kevin Young made these beautiful sort of tercets, three-line things, and kind of to sort of chime with Dante's original three-line stanzas. So poets work with older literatures all the time, and they do magnificent, interesting things that really let us know that these are still living. That's the thing about form. When it still works for people, it's still alive. It's not just a kind of museum piece.
Yeah, and all of this is so fascinating to me because just in my kind of exploration of poetry, I had always either been sticking very close to form as kind of a crutch, or on the complete opposite side, I just kind of shunned all of the form in my head because I was like, well, it's too hard. I'm just going to try to do whatever.
Right. It's hard not to just want to rebel immediately. So it's funny. I would say I occasionally write in what would look like a kind of received form. Which is funny. My first, I guess I would call it a poetry workshop. It really wasn't. When I was in college, I did some writing in high school, sure, and I had a great teacher. I had a number of fantastic teachers in a small upstate New York town. I was really lucky. Kind of just a little school in a little town, but I had phenomenal literature and theater teachers, and one of whom really introduced me to poetry. But later in college, my very first it was a poetry writing experience that was sort of in a classroom. It was actually not a creative writing workshop yet. I did that later. It was a prosody seminar, and it was taught by someone who also taught Shakespeare. And it was really about the formal kind of meter, verse, rhyme, all of that. And I learned so much. And I wrote for that sort of course in that idiom. And I didn't really, again, I occasionally will break out a sonnet and maybe I'll read one later that's actually a villanelle, but I don't do that so often. But what I will say is behind every poem I write is a kind of music that comes from having studied form. So I feel like it really has an imprint on my poetry, but you wouldn't look at it and say, oh, look, there's a sonnet, there's a villanelle, here's a sestina. I don't really work that way, but my sense of musicality and rhythm comes from studying prosody. And it's kind of, so in some ways, I like the idea that poets would start with that, not because they have to do it forever, and it doesn't work for everybody, which is totally fine, right? But if it gives you a sense of when and how music can be musical and rhythmic, it gives us a real sense of that, and I really am grateful for that. I mean, again, it wasn't something I planned out, but it was definitely has been part of my experience with form. There's a kind of ghost of it everywhere, even though I don't write in it primarily.
And just hearing that from you, I think that is definitely advice that I should take in terms of reading more of these kinds of received form pieces so that I can kind of adapt them for my own purposes, which I've been kind of lacking in recently. So,
well, I mean, look, there's no one way to do any of this, right? So it's less about this is the way to do it. But I will say there are benefits for different strategies, because in something that I feel like is important early in a writing life, especially, and actually later too, but especially early, is a kind of flexibility. I think there's a sense that we need to find our voices sort of almost immediately. It's like, well, really, how realistic is that? That doesn't mean we aren't trying to sound like ourselves. We of course are trying to figure out, what do I sound like? What's distinctively me when I write a poem? Of course, in some ways it's happening, so we don't have to work at it. It's going to happen. And in some ways early on, it seems to me that kind of flexibility, trying out a lot of different kinds of things, is so useful, because then as you do come into a sense of how you want to sound on the page, your sort of your toolbox or your strategies, you have tons of them. Not because you needed to follow any one exclusively as the one way that you write, but because you've got options, and then they become adapted to the sound that emerges, that is sort of you on the page or on the screen. I like the idea that, yeah, we have a lot at our disposal that we can try out. And actually, maybe that's good later in a career too, that we don't get too stuck in ruts. We do want to sound like ourselves, but we also want to challenge ourselves and keep opening our minds and our ways of being in language.
yeah, and I feel that's pretty relevant to, and okay, sorry for tying it back to myself again, but
No,
just
please do.
um, recently I feel as if there was this period where I was kind of stuck in kind of a rut as well. And I wanted to take that opportunity to kind of pivot in terms of I had been writing a lot of a certain style beforehand, and I've been recently searching. I've been writing less, but I've been recently trying to search for new styles that I can kind of start getting into. And I think it really emerged out of me kind of getting complacent with the way I had always written before. And it got to the point where I would always look at a piece of work and it wouldn't be as exciting to even like read it myself anymore because it's just, oh, it's more of the same.
Yeah. This is what I think this is what writers struggle with at many points in their careers. Early on, it feels more damning. It feels more like, oh my God, this might be the end, right? I'm stuck. I think over time, it becomes easier to see it as part of a longer path. But early on, you don't feel like you've hit successes yet, whatever those mean. And so as a consequence, any bump in the road or any sense like, oh my God, I'm just writing the same poem over and over again, or oh my, I feel like I'm not writing right now. Those feels devastating early. I think one of the issues is really that it's funny. Working on poetry is different. Some people really need to be almost like more like they're at a desk at a 9 to 5, and some people it needs to hit in the moment, and then that's when they work on it. So there are a lot of different working attitudes. But what we really can use is just a fresh mind that's ready either to sort of put in the hours or to have the moment in the middle of wherever it happens, or sometimes a little bit of both. It's hard to have a fresh mind right now. I think in the last couple of years, I haven't been writing myself very much, and I've been a pretty sort of consistently. I've tended to write a lot. Not all of it becomes the work that you stay with or that ends up in a book or whatever it is. But really, I just think there's a kind of fatigue. For those of us who have been safe enough, and I've been fortunate to be, there's a kind of fatigue that's built up. I know some writers who have really thrived in this moment, this very strange couple years in the world, strange and kind of devastating couple years in the world. And I know more that have just been exhausted and don't have the kind of mental space for those sort of acts. So we always have to figure out, like, is it, it can feel like it's just me, I'm terrible, I'm never going to write. It can also be, this is a really weird, hard time, or, okay, I'm a little stuck, so I have to have some patience, right? Sometimes it's like when you read a poem, you don't understand it the first time, you have to be patient and you revisit it. And then sometimes writing is like that too. We have to be ready to revisit, today wasn't the day the poem came, or today was the day where I felt like I wrote that same the same poem again. Okay, maybe tomorrow will be better. But it's hard to have that patience. But it's part of the very meditative quality poetry has. It doesn't always sound like a kind of quiet, peaceful meditation. Poems can be raucous and boisterous and all sorts of things, but the act of being with poems is a kind of fundamentally meditative thing. So sometimes we just have to wait for the day when the mind really can focuses and can make the poem happen.
Yeah, I definitely think I need some patience in that aspect.
That's the hardest virtue, right? Patience
Yeah.
is really hard.
And if you're ready, we can get into a poem.
Oh, sure. I'd love to read one since we've been talking a bit about form. So I'll say the most recent, published 3 books. The most recent is a book called The Book of Life. And my books come out of just what fascinates me. So my first book was really a fascination with cinema, and I got caught up in how people become devoted to film icons. My second book was really about a kind of rural place I was living in Ohio, and these sort of more quiet, meditative poems. Book of Life is about becoming fascinated with Life magazine, this incredible document from the 30s to the 70s, all of what became history, right? And what was history when I was in elementary school was represented. And so I became fascinated with those and wrote a series of poems that were in response to the particular issues, and then coupled with poems that were really about growing up in upstate New York, kind of in the wake of these big events, right? So I'm going to read one that is actually a form. Probably get I probably bend it a little bit, and it's actually a villanelle. It's called Blackout, and it's for an issue of Life magazine from November 9 of 1965. I might say a word about it after, but this is Blackout. I love you best in the dark, asleep on the train, asleep on the stairs, the city now stilled, the body itself, but now, somehow, no longer alone. Asleep in the lobby, asleep in a chair, I love you best in the dark. Night's curtain drawn. Come night. Come lovers in restaurants, in tunnels, in cars, the body now still, the city at rest. Asleep in the city, asleep at the wheel. No one can see what you did in the light, your best in the dark. Night's curtain descend and arise, O moon, by fortune full. Reveal what hides, what's born, what dies. The body won't flee, the city won't fight. Love in the night, birth in the night. Oh, hideous acts hiding in the light, candles and flares. I love you best in the dark. Alone in the dark, together alone. What is dark, illumine. What is wretched, hide. Your body's a city, recoiling from light, harmless in the dark. I think of you best.
Wow.
It's an incredible issue of the magazine. It was, as the title tells you, in a blackout. And these photos of people just sort of resting and waiting for the power to come back on. All the transit was shut down. These wonderful sort of moments of sweetness, actually, and collaboration. Babies being born. I just was so struck by those. And so I tried to build something that gave that feel. Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of definitely you're lending yourself the poem lends itself to that kind of rhythmic feel, which I think really wraps the whole thing together, because you are progressing at this steady pace, and at the same time it kind of drives you forward through each of the images and through the image as a whole.
Villanelles are funny. Many forms work through repetition, and we're often taught that repetition is bad, like if you just repeat yourself. Well, unthinking repetition usually is bad. It's thoughtless, right? It's not a kind of precise or conscious use of language, whether it's in prose or poetry. Repetition harnessed, that means every time you repeat something, it's amplified, or you repeat it and alter it a little bit. So I do a little more altering. And the villanelle is a form that has a lot of repetition built into it, sort of a first and third, sort of two lines keep repeating across a number of stanzas. So villanelle can also drive you crazy. Some of them can feel claustrophobic. So I was a little surprised at myself using that form, because it's not one I inclined to. But it kind of worked. So yeah.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.